Hello, hello. You're listening to the Bitcoin Advocate podcast. I am your host, Andy. And if you're new here, welcome. This is a show where we discuss all things Bitcoin on a weekly basis. This is a show that I wish I had when I first got into Bitcoin, which is why I started this podcast. This is your one-stop shop of complex topics in the wonderful world of Bitcoin, explained in simple ways. As a reminder, this show is available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, and a whole bunch of other platforms. So wherever you might be listening from, if you like the show, be sure to follow and subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/thebtcadvocate. Today's episode is sponsored by myself. More specifically, I have a book called Hyper-Bitcoinization, A Story About a Revolution. And if you're watching this on YouTube, there's a link down below in the description for that book. Otherwise, you can search for the title on Amazon and it should be the first result. It's not selling out if it's my own product. Just a recap of last week, we talked about central bank digital currencies, aka CBDCs, and the potential dangers of governments using CBDCs as a means of control to deprive the country's citizens of freedom and human rights. So that's a very interesting and very important episode, so be sure to check out that episode if you haven't already. This week, we're circling back to discussing the technical properties of Bitcoin, and in particular, how do crypto wallets work. So this applies to not just Bitcoin, but also other digital assets too. For me, this was the part that confused me the most when I first got into Bitcoin. So if you missed the first ever episode of this podcast, in episode 1, I shared my personal story of how I got into Bitcoin. This was perhaps maybe 2014 or 2015. And back then I was in university and one of my roommates was into Bitcoin. And he taught me how to set up a wallet and whatnot. And back then I just didn't get it, right? So basically I was like, okay, you're telling me I have to write down this random assortment of 24 words, which doesn't make any discernible sentence. And they're just random or seemingly random English words. And I only have to keep written copies of it, and I'm not allowed to upload it on any cloud servers, and I'm not allowed to share this phrase with anyone. Okay, that's kind of strange, right? And he goes, well, yeah, that's right. You got it, essentially. And we just left it at that. So, I understood how to set it up, but I didn't really understand any of the meaning behind it. So I had real trouble with wrapping my head around this concept. This idea of how if I lost my seed phrase, then my Bitcoin would be gone. Whereas if I lost the password to my, let's say, online banking password, then I could just reset it, no problem, and my money would still be there, right? Again, all this is to say that this was a huge stumbling block for me when I first got into Bitcoin. And if you're similarly confused right now, as I was back in 2015, then let me try to help you now with newfound knowledge. So first, let's talk about what a wallet is not. A Bitcoin wallet doesn't actually hold any Bitcoin. I know that first part is already mind-blowing. So you got to think about what Bitcoin actually is, okay? So it's a balance that is associated with an address. So call it an account if it makes you feel better, but the correct term is a Bitcoin address, right? Anyways, it's a balance associated with an address that is on the blockchain. This means that Bitcoin can only exist on the Bitcoin blockchain. There is nowhere else the Bitcoin can exist. But a wallet is what holds your private keys. So your private keys are what's needed to move the Bitcoin if you ever want to spend the Bitcoin. So every Bitcoin address has two special numbers. One is called the public key and one is called the private key. A public key is what's used to generate the actual address, which you can share with other individuals. You know, that long string of letters and numbers that you give to people to tell them where to send Bitcoin if they want to pay you in Bitcoin, right? A private key, though, is a special number, and as the name suggests, must be kept private. Now, you don't have to understand how the encryption itself works, but just know that you need the private key to sign a Bitcoin transaction every time you want to move Bitcoin from an address. And furthermore, the math is designed such that if you don't know the private key and try to guess what it could be, even if you had a supercomputer, it would take you like trillions and trillions of years. It would take you so long that it would make it completely impractical. So the term wallet is really a misnomer. When we say wallet, we envision that the Bitcoin are actually inside the wallet, which is not true. The more accurate term should be a keychain because it holds the keys that you need to access the Bitcoin. So a simpler way to visualize this is pretend that there is a huge bank with billions and billions of safety deposit boxes. Think of Gringotts if you ever seen Harry Potter, right? And you have a keychain that holds all the keys that you need to open the boxes that belong to you. So in the case of Bitcoin, the boxes are the Bitcoin addresses and the keychain is your wallet. So if you lose a seed phrase, as in you lose this keychain or wallet or whatever you want to call it, the Bitcoin doesn't go anywhere. It's still sitting in that Bitcoin address, except no one can ever access it again because it's impossible to remake the private key. But for the sake of convention, though, we'll still refer to a crypto wallet as a wallet. Specifically, though, let's formally define it. So a crypto wallet or a Bitcoin wallet, if you will, but this applies to other digital assets as well, is a device or piece of software that holds the private keys to specific addresses where the coins are held. So expanding upon this idea, now that we have gone through the basics of public and private key pairs, as you can see, Bitcoin storage, or the storage of any digital assets for that matter, is all about how to store these private keys. So in the early days of Bitcoin, there were countless stories of people losing their Bitcoin because they accidentally deleted their private keys or damaged or lost a hard drive that contained the only copy of their private keys. So, again, it's not that the Bitcoins themselves were on the hard drive, it's that the hard drive contained the private keys, which they lost the hard drive or accidentally broke it or somehow destroyed it, right? Because the private key is just a very special number, it's just data at the end of the day, right? Although Bitcoin itself might be decentralized, a Bitcoin holder, if you only possess a single copy of a private key on a single device, this still represents a single point of failure for that specific user. And also note that each address has its own private key. This means that the most basic way to store crypto is that if a Bitcoin holder has 15 addresses, then they would need to store 15 private keys. So this kind of already you can see how it's unsustainable, right? So if you ran a Bitcoin company, let's say, and you had 100,000 users where a whole series of addresses are needed for each user, you can see how the logistics of this private key management quickly spirals out of control. And also, since private keys are in essence just very large numbers, once again, they might be easy for computers to deal with, but practically impossible for humans to memorize. So for Bitcoin, private keys are 256 bits in length, represented in hexadecimal. The private key is still 64 characters long. You're not going to be able to memorize a 64 character long string of numbers and letters, right? What if there was a way to solve all these problems, though? What if we can make a wallet that lets you easily store a whole series of private keys and allow for backup copies of the private keys that are human readable and human memorizable? So that is where the technology of hierarchical deterministic wallets, or HD wallet, comes in. So if you ever see that term HD wallet, HD stands for hierarchical deterministic wallets. It does not stand for high definition wallet. So hierarchical deterministic wallets work by generating private keys in a way that establishes a tree structure. So imagine a family tree, right? So there's a set of, let's say, great-great-grandparents that you're descended from, but by the time it gets to you, the bottom branches out a lot and you're just one kid out of many people that you're related to, right? So first, we derive a single master key from a seed phrase. So again, the seed phrase is that list of 12 or 24 English words, right? So we use that seed phrase and we derive a single master key from it. And every private key is subsequently generated by the wallet that is derived from that single master key. So the term hierarchical implies that there's a specific order in which the keys are generated. So it describes so-called child keys, which are derived from the master key. So the child keys can also be used to generate their own child keys. So it kind of spreads out like a tree, right? So like a family tree, you have one master key at the top and then you have child keys. So the term deterministic means that the same seed phrase will always generate the same master key. and that will in turn generate the same child keys and the same grandchild keys and so on and so forth. And since each private key is generated through a series of calculations beginning with the seed phrase, the Bitcoin holder is not required to store every private key. Any private key that is on this tree that is generated can be regenerated at will using the seed phrase. This is the deterministic property of HD wallets, meaning that we can shift the entire task of private key storage to memorizing or storing just one master seed phrase, because you can just always regenerate the tree at any time if you have the seed phrase. Therefore, whether one wants to store 15 private keys or 1500 private keys, both tasks can be accomplished with the same level of complexity. So to be clear, why does this method of storage solve the aforementioned issues with people losing their hard drives and in turn losing their Bitcoin? Well, since the keys can be regenerated at will using the seed phrase, as long as you have the seed phrase, it doesn't matter if the device or wallet software you're using gets damaged or destroyed. If you accidentally break your hardware wallet, you can just buy a new one and set it up using the same seed phrase that you have, and then you can regain access to all your crypto. Now let's spend some time and talk about exactly where do the words for the seed phrase come from, as in how are they chosen. So all these seed phrases are generated, as I said, from a list of 2048 possible words. And this list of 2048 words is from the Bitcoin Improvement Protocol 39, or BIP-39 for short. So this list of words was carefully chosen by computer scientists who wanted some specific properties. So some unique properties of these words include the purposeful avoidance of similar words on the list, such as quick versus quickly or women versus woman. Furthermore, each word of the list is uniquely identifiable by just the first 4 letters. Some of the words are only 3 letters long, in which case this rule is still technically true, right? But anyways, initially it doesn't seem like seed phrases are all that secure. As you're probably aware by now, anyone who has access to the seed phrase can regenerate all the private keys that are derived from that seed phrase at will and pretty much instantly. So whoever controls the seed phrase controls all the Bitcoin that is associated with any address that's on that tree. So basically the entire wallet. So if you're using online banking, you're most likely securing that account with a password, which can be anything, right? Which can be anything that you dream up, can be any combination of words and any characters. However, when it comes to Bitcoin, you might be thinking, what, am I supposed to secure my entire fortune with only 12 or 24 words? What if someone randomly guesses my seed phrase? What if someone accidentally generates the same seed phrase as me? So to address those concerns, it's worth exploring the mathematics that is used to secure seed phrases. So for reference, the total number of particles in the universe is estimated to be about 10 to the 80 particles, according to popularmechanics.com. For a 24-word seed phrase, the number of possibilities is 2048 to the power of 24, which, doing a quick approximation, that is approximately equal to 2.96 times 10 to the power of 79. So therefore, a 24-word seed phrase, the possible combinations of a 24-word seed phrase, are only slightly less in relative terms to the total number of particles in the universe. So the chances of someone randomly being able to guess a given seed phrase is incredibly small. Even a 12-word seed phrase that works out to be 2048 to the power of 12 possible combinations, that is a mind-bogglingly large number as well. And that is also considered sufficiently secured by cybersecurity experts, as in you can sit there with the supercomputer and crank out seed phrases all day, and you can do that for 1,000 years and still not get a single one that has a non-zero balance in it. So I hope that goes to convince you that seed phrases are incredibly secure. And now that we've talked about how Bitcoin storage technology is designed, let's spend a little bit of time talking about what you can do to ensure that you're following the protocol. And what I mean by that is that you must recognize the whole seed phrase thing, the BIP-39, was designed by computer scientists who considered every aspect of security versus convenience and decided that this seed phrase thing was the best practice, was the best balance between the two. This means that unless you're an extreme computer scientist who really know what you're doing and you're a super expert, you should not try to implement your own storage solution scheme or modify the protocol in any way. For example, I know it is tempting to take a seed phrase and break it into 3 segments where each segment contains, let's say, 2/3 of the seed phrase. So at first, this seemed to make sense, right? As it would require an agent to get hold of at least 2 out of the 3 segments before they can have a full seed phrase and can access the wallet. However, in practice, what this means is that for a 24-word seed phrase, even one segment of the seed phrase, which contains 2/3 of it, right? So it contains 16 words. And this would mean that only 8 words would remain unknown rather than the original 24 words. So it is commonly accepted that a minimum of 12 words is required to prevent a brute force attack, meaning that having a computer randomly guess the combinations. So by doing so, you've made yourself insecure, because if an agent gets hold of just one piece, they have 16 out of the 24 words in the correct order, and they know like which 8 are missing, but they don't know which 8 it is. They can brute force the remaining 8. So therefore, it is possible for a skilled attacker to eventually figure out the remaining 8 words by randomly guessing. So if this seed phrase splitting scheme is done with a 12-word seed phrase, the result is even more catastrophic, since one segment would only be missing 4 words, which would be very easy to brute force. And other schemes of seed splitting are also not recommended. Some users may, for example, devise some convoluted scheme to put one word of a 12-word seed phrase on the 12th page of 12 of their favorite books. Devising a convoluted scheme like this would not be recommended, as a user would put themselves at risk of forgetting the scheme that they themselves came up with, leading to the loss of the seed phrase. Because remember, the seed phrase must also be in a specific order. So even if all the words are there, it's useless without being in order. Therefore, this is an example of a threat to one's own Bitcoin as a result of one's own actions. So it's classified under the category of internal threats. And we must guard ourselves against internal threats, right? There's already a lot of external threats out there. We don't need any internal threats. The reality is that for the users of a wallet, they must understand that Bitcoin storage or crypto storage in general, these solutions have been debated and developed for years by experts in the cybersecurity field to balance security with ease of use. So one should not deviate from the recommendations of how to store crypto securely. The recommended way of storing seed phrases is to write down the words in full, in order, on a piece of paper, and preferably laminate the paper to protect it from water damage. For those who are willing to spend a little bit more money, some products will allow you to etch your seed phrase into metal, which would have the added benefit of extra durability and protection against fire damage. And it is always recommended to have at least 2 copies of the seed phrase stored in different geographic locations. This would help prevent the loss of seed phrases due to natural disasters like a flood or a hurricane. So if you store one, let's say, in a bank vault somewhere, and then the bank gets destroyed by an earthquake, well, then you still have another one somewhere else. And lastly, one should avoid having any digital copies of the seed phrase, specifically digital copies stored in cloud storage accounts. This will prevent the seed phrase from being compromised in a cyber attack. Again, you want to keep your seed phrase as far away from any internet-connected devices as possible. And there's always a risk if you expose your seed phrase to the internet in any way, even if it's in an encrypted format. But anyways, as centuries of philosophers and a myriad of motivational YouTube videos have described, to overcome adversity is to overcome oneself. Beginners in Bitcoin often put an emphasis on defending themselves against external threats, but fail to take adequate measures to guard their own digital assets against their greatest threat, which is themselves. The reality is that you're much more likely to lose your Bitcoin because of a mistake that you made yourself when trying to store the crypto. For example, again, not storing the seed phrase properly or throwing out a hard drive where the private keys are stored, rather than getting your Bitcoin stolen by a house robber, let's say. And lastly, on the notes of good crypto storage solution practices, we don't like to think about it, but there's always going to be a day when we inevitably kick the bucket, right? Everyone has to die someday. And there have been instances where an individual with a massive fortune in Bitcoin died unexpectedly, and the remaining family members could not locate the deceased party's seed phrase. If the remaining family members of the deceased Bitcoiner are not tech savvy enough, this may leave them susceptible to scams and other scenarios where the wealth can be lost or stolen. So, therefore, it is best to leave instructions for loved ones on gaining access to one's Bitcoin if, let's say, a tragic event were to occur, but hopefully not, knock on wood. Alternatively, if you choose to let the Bitcoin perish with you, due to the supply cap of Bitcoin, if you die without leaving any copies of the seed phrase behind, then you would have permanently removed your Bitcoin from the circulating supply, since that Bitcoin would never be accessible again. So this would mean that it would be a donation to the rest of the Bitcoin community, since it would decrease the supply and make the remaining Bitcoin more valuable. Not that I would recommend anyone doing that. It is my wish that people should be able to hold on to the wealth that they generate and be able to pass on that wealth to the next generation. But ultimately, that choice would be up to you. Anyways, let's wrap it up here for this week. We've talked about a lot. We talked about wallets. We talked about best crypto storage practices. But next week, let's talk a bit more on just general security practices. And I'll title next week's episode, How to Not Lose Your Bitcoin. So be sure to tune in for that one. And for now, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.